Carl Russell was no stranger to the unforgiving streets of Liverpool. His name resonated throughout the city, not as some passerby or minor player, but as a man with a reputation built on years of crime, prison time, and a long list of unsettled rivalries. By 2019, Carl knew the risks that came with his status: prison sentences, violent confrontations, and a shadow of unfinished business that stretched over his every move. From robbery to violent crimes, Carl's record painted the life of a man entangled in a cycle where each choice added another enemy, each prison sentence left another grudge. The high-risk life he led didn't come without consequences. By 2010, Carl's reputation had become a target on his back. That year, in a brutal, targeted attack, Carl was shot, an event that shook his world and left a lasting impact both physically and mentally. Surviving a hit is no small feat in a realm where life is cheap and violence is the language of the streets. But Carl didn't retreat. Instead, the near-death experience propelled him further into the world that both revered and reviled him. To many, surviving made him something of a legend. Yet he knew well that every legend has a last chapter, and his enemies were far from finished. A cycle of retaliation, life as a marked man. Surviving the 2010 shooting didn't lessen Carl's notoriety, it amplified it, setting him apart as a man marked by fate. The streets operate by their own code, and Carl had been inscribed in it. His was a story where there were no second chances, only pauses in the inevitable. Once you're in as deep as he was, escaping the cycle isn't an option. His enemies knew this, and Carl, too, was aware that the bullet had only delayed the inevitable. He continued his life, living each day as if it were just another chapter in the saga of Liverpool's underworld. Through every prison stint and brush with the law, Carl stayed connected to the life that had both made him and, eventually, would claim him. By 2019, he found himself back behind the walls of HMP Thorn Cross, a Category D prison for low-risk offenders. But for Carl, this wasn't a time for rehabilitation. It was merely a brief respite from the conflicts waiting on the outside. As far as his enemies were concerned, Carl was still a target, and his temporary day release only presented a new opportunity. A deadly day release, the trap set for Carl Russell. September 23, 2019 was meant to be an ordinary day for Carl, a brief moment of freedom on day release to visit family. For most prisoners, it's a glimpse of normality, but for Carl, it was a calculated trap. He had no illusions about what freedom really meant. He understood that any day could be his last. His enemies knew where he'd be, and with a strictly timed schedule, it wasn't hard to predict his movements. Information flows effortlessly through the underworld, and those who sought his life had more than enough time to prepare. Carl's day release would be his undoing. He planned to see his girlfriend, visit his mother's home in Belle Vale, and savor a few hours of life outside the prison walls. But those with a vendetta knew his routine. Someone, somewhere, had been keeping close tabs on him, waiting for the moment he'd let his guard down. And on that day, they were ready. His brief time on the outside turned from a simple family visit to a trap set with meticulous precision. The cycle of the streets was about to claim its due. The final hit, a cold, calculated assassination. October 7, 2018 unfolded like any other day until Carl and his girlfriend arrived at his mother's quiet street in Belle Vale. It was a serene neighborhood, the sort of place where violence felt out of place. But as Carl stepped out of his car, the streets came alive with the echoes of his past. Someone had been waiting, a figure on a bicycle wearing a high-visibility jacket. An unassuming sight in a quiet community. Blending into the morning routine, the assassin approached without raising suspicion, until it was too late. In a rapid, brutal attack, the gunman fired multiple shots, the sound breaking the calm of the day. Carl was struck down by a hail of bullets, each aimed with lethal precision. His girlfriend stood nearby, helpless as the scene unfolded in seconds, and then, like a ghost, the assassin was gone. The high-visibility jacket, meant to make him look like a workman or cyclist, became his perfect disguise. He rode off into the ordinary streets, vanishing as though he had never been there. The paramedics could do nothing for Carl. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The Code of Silence, an investigation stalled by fear. The Merseyside police sprang into action, launching an immediate investigation. But the community fell silent almost instantly, a phenomenon familiar to those who understand the unspoken code of the streets. Witnesses feared retaliation, and despite extensive door-to-door inquiries and CCTV footage that captured the gunman's approach, leads ran dry. The man in the high-vis jacket had blended into the urban landscape, and even with a $20,000 reward on offer, no one came forward. In Liverpool's Gangland, the price of speaking out is often too high to pay. 3 men were eventually arrested, raising a flicker of hope that the case might be solved. But the silence persisted. Each suspect was released without charge, and the investigation ground to a halt. The Gangland Code of Loyalty kept anyone with information from speaking up, leaving the streets shrouded in secrets and the memory of Carl's death preserved in an unbreakable silence. Carl's legacy, a life defined by conflict and consequence. For Carl Russell, his life was a complex story of loyalty and enmity, marked by violent events that only cemented his position in Liverpool's criminal history. His death was not a random act, but a calculated end to a life where survival meant being a constant target. Each prison sentence, each rivalry, each close call had built up to that fatal moment on a quiet street. The question of who ordered his killing and why remains unanswered, but the layers of Carl's past suggest ample motives. Carl's involvement in organized crime, particularly in a city with deep gang rivalries, put him in a volatile network of alliances and enmities. Liverpool's gangs often clash over drug territories and supply chains, and Carl's extensive history placed him at the heart of these disputes. Perhaps he had crossed the wrong people, or maybe prison grudges had spilled out into the streets. Whatever the cause, it was clear that his life was claimed by a debt only the streets could settle. Unsettled scores, the price of power in Gangland. Liverpool. Gangland Liverpool operates on a cycle of loyalty, betrayal, and retribution. Carl's 2010 shooting could have been part of an earlier dispute, unfinished business from his days in the Underworld. In these circles, debts aren't simply financial, they're personal, with grudges and vendettas often carried through years of simmering tension. Surviving one hit often means inviting another, and for Carl, his resilience only reinforced the belief that his time would eventually run out. His death was a message, perhaps a settlement of an old score. Whether the result of a drug feud, an unpaid debt, or a personal betrayal, Carl's murder was the ultimate form of street justice. The planning behind the hit suggested patience and forethought, with his killers aware of his every movement. In Gangland, loyalty is a fragile thing, easily shattered when a bigger stake is at hand. The street's verdict: life in the shadows of crime. For Carl, life was a series of close calls until the inevitable happened. His story serves as a stark reminder of the life that so many caught up in gang culture live, marked by threats, survival, and eventually, tragic ends. Behind the reputation and the violence, Carl's death sheds light on the high cost of gang life in Liverpool, a city where organized crime grips communities with a relentless hold. In the end, the streets don't forget. And as much as Carl may have shaped his world was ultimately shaped by forces even he couldn't outrun. A life lost to the streets. Lessons from a life of crime. Carl's story is emblematic of the broader dangers of gang life in the UK's urban centres. For those who enter this world, the stakes are high and few walk away unscathed. His murder remains unsolved, but the message resonates. In the underworld, the past is never truly buried. Each grudge and rivalry is a reminder that in the shadowed corners of society, debts are paid in blood, and each decision in life carves the path to an inescapable end. For more gritty and real crime stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Until our next episode, stay aware and remember, the streets have their own rules, and they don't often show mercy.